Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Koenig, and this course is Assessment and Evaluation. We are going to focus on Chapter 8, which is validity. So, what is validity? Validity, boiled down to the simplest definition, is whether or not we are measuring what we think we're measuring. So, if we have a test that's designed to measure depression, we want to be sure that we're measuring depression. To the degree that we're not, that test or the data coming from that test is not valid. Um, Validity also can be in reference to whether or not we are using a test in the way that it was intended, whether we are using it appropriately. Validity, it's not something it's an either or, it's just a matter of degree. We can have something that has very low validity or nearly zero validity, or something that has extremely high validity. So it's in a range. Validity, according to your text, is a unitary concept, and that is something that is fairly new in the testing and assessment world. And we'll talk about that a little more as we move through the content. Validity is also specific to a particular group. So if we have a test that's normed for high school students, that test would not necessarily be valid if we were using it for 5-year-olds or if we were using it for someone who's 95, the geriatric population or something like that. So we do want to make sure that when we are using an instrument, that it is valid for the person or the group of persons that we're intending to use it with. So we want to do a little bit of refresher on constructs. And constructs, the way that I think of this, I think the way that it's easiest, at least for me, to think of it, is as an abstract concept. In the last chapter, I talked about the variable of weight. And weight is a concrete variable. It is not a construct. It's a variable that we can easily measure with a scale. So it's not something that is abstract. If we look at anger or relationship satisfaction, love, oh, I've got anger in there twice. Sales performance, which is something that I think is used in your text, so I threw that in there. Depression, anything that it's not something that is concrete, it is this abstract concept. I don't know of a better way to say that. So those concepts are not immediately measurable. And in order to measure them, we have to figure out what variables contribute to them. And I use the word variables here, but that makes it a little bit more confusing because a construct sometimes is called a variable itself, but it is made up of other dimensions, might be another way to put it. And we have to figure out all of the things that contribute to that construct. When we figure out the things that contribute to the construct, we then operationalize the construct. That's part of doing research on the construct, or what folks who are constructing tests and assessment have to do to operationalize the construct and investigate it. And we'll talk a little bit more about operationalizing constructs. So, sales performance, and this is why I added sales performance to that list of abstract concepts, because this is the example that's used in your text on page 154. So, if we were going to operationalize sales performance and look at that, what we would want to do is we would want to look at all the component parts of what contributes to sales performance. And we then make this table of specifications that you see here. So the content areas, according to the folks who were doing this, you can see here as motivation and initiative and persistence and on down the line. So all of these content areas are what these researchers believe contribute to sales performance. And then what they will do is they will figure out how many items do we think are needed in our assessment on motivation and initiative. So they've got 5 items or tasks in this assessment, and they do this for each one of the content areas. If they are doing that well, then all of the dimensions or content areas that contribute to sales performance should be accounted for. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about intelligence, or you're thinking about measuring for anxiety or achievement or aptitude, anything like that. It has to be broken up. Anything that's a construct has to be broken up into its content areas. So many threats to validity are on this list, but one of those is construct underrepresentation. So if we haven't done a very good job looking at the content areas, then the construct might not be well represented in all of its content areas. Or if we've thought that maybe, you know, good looks are relevant to sales performance, there probably would be an argument that they are. I don't know. But we might have some measure in sales performance of the attractiveness of the salesperson. And that may turn out to be irrelevant. And if it, to the extent that we have included things within our construct that are irrelevant, that presents a threat to validity. There can also be other factors within the test, maybe the length of the test, maybe the flow of the test, the way that is physically put together, maybe typos in the test. Administration and scoring procedures, we've talked about this in other places, but each of those things can, of course, impact whether or not the data from the test is valid. And then test taker characteristics, and whether or not we are using an assessment or a test in a way that is appropriate for the test that, or the group that we are wanting to test, or the individual that we are wanting to test. So reliability and validity, we talked about that at length in the last chapter. And I lifted this little snapshot from the video that we used in the last chapter. And I just want to mention this again, that a test can be very reliable, but that doesn't make it valid. So we can have high reliability and no validity, or we can have moderate, maybe sort of on the cusp here, reliability. We sort of have it within the outer circle, but the validity for this test, because the reliability is so broad, would still be fairly low. What we're wanting to have a test that's actually measuring what it is we think we're measuring, and an instrument that's doing that in a reliable fashion. So we have high reliability and high validity. So there are traditional ways that we describe validity, and the tripartite view focuses on these 3. Content validity, meaning, was the construct adequately operationalized? And does it really represent the construct? Criterion validity, which represents the correlation between our test results and some external criterion that is the same. Or construct validity, which is, do the test scores lead us to appropriate inferences regarding the construct? So traditionally, these are the 3 major types of validity. There are other types of validity, but these are the 3 major ones that we looked at. We've been given a new model, and that is the unitary concept of validity. Now, keep in mind that as I was looking through this, I'm looking at the unitary concept of validity And all of the forms of validity that we've talked about traditionally are conceptualized within the unitary concept. So um, it's not that we're throwing out the old types of validity, but we have a new framework to view things from within. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, and where appropriate, I will also talk about how that connects to the traditional view. So, test content validity evidence. It refers to the relationship between a test content and the construct it's intended to measure. Now, we've just been talking about that, right? So, that goes back to how well did we operationalize that construct? That's not a new concept, but it is part of this larger framework of validity and seeing validity not as separate dimensions, looking at one part of validity and saying, well, because construct validity is high, it's a valid instrument. But the unitary view is that we need to look at all of the different types of validity and assess it as a whole. So then we have evidence based on response processes. Response processes can be something as simple as when someone is sitting down to take this test, we have them basically speak out loud what their thought process is. So if they are sitting down to take the test and the test or the assessment is on depression and they're thinking about paranoia, then that might not be an indicator that our assessment question is valid or questions are valid. So that's just one small example. Then we look at evidence based on the internal structure. And the internal structure, we sometimes use the term dimensionality, and we want to know if our assessment is measuring just sort of the general construct, it's one dimensional, or if it's measuring several components of a construct or it's multidimensional. And the way that we try to figure that out is using factor analysis. And we can use factor analysis to explore the dimensions or to confirm the dimensions that we think are there, or both. This looks at the internal structure of the test and will give us an idea of each of the individual questions or groups of questions on the test are actually valid for the construct that we think that we're measuring. Then we have more evidence that's based on internal structure, and that is measurement and variance, or how fair and unbiased the test is, and whether or not it's going to apply to the population that we're trying to examine and subgroups of that population. And then we have internal consistency, which which sometimes we are going to measure with factor analysis that we already talked about, the degree to which it is internally consistent speaks to the quality of the internal structure. Then we want to look at evidence based on the consequences of testing. And this really refers to the intended consequence of testing, which might be identifying someone who is depressed for services, or it could be identifying someone for a talented and gifted program, or identifying someone who needs academic remediation. It can also refer to the unintended consequences. And I want you to think about this in terms of, if we are in an academic setting, what might be some of the unintended consequences of an assessment if we're in a criminal justice setting or an employment setting. So sometimes assessments are used in ways that they are not intended to be used. And some of those consequences can be very high stakes. So we also want to look at evidence that's based on relationships to other variables. And this is where previously, we would have maybe used the term construct related validity or construct validity, or where we would have used the term predictive validity. And construct validity is exactly what it says it is, predictive validity the same. We're trying to predict a person's performance or behavior. And I thought I had put an example in here. Maybe the slides are out of order, so hopefully we'll run into that in a minute. So validity coefficients, if we're looking for validity, we can look at that based on the correlation with a criterion or with another instrument. And we're looking for the range from -1, which is a perfect negative correlation, to +1, which is a perfect positive correlation. And of course, we know that the chances of having a perfect positive correlation or negative correlation is very slim. It's hopefully we're looking for something that's has a high positive correlation. And here is the example that I thought that I had put in regard to prediction errors. So if we have an instrument that is an aptitude test and we're looking at how well does this aptitude test predict job success, we can look at it sort of in this quadrant. And this is in your book. It's on page 160 of your text. So what we want is we want true positives and we want true negatives. So if we have a false positive, we have predicted this person is going to be successful, but they are not, then that's a false positive. Or if we have a false negative, we've predicted that this person will not be successful based on their aptitude test, but they are successful. So what we really want is we really want to decrease the amount of false positives and false negative errors. Okay, and then we have evidence it's based on relationship to other variables and the sources of where those things are coming from. I've not included all of these like 1 through 6. I've included 3 or 4 because the terminology is something that is important, and I just want to focus on that really. So homogeneity is a term that you should know. Especially when it comes to the NCE, you want to make sure that you understand homogeneity. And homogeneity refers to how uniform the items are in measuring a single concept. It is one means of providing evidence of the internal structure of a test. And homogeneity can be tested in factor analysis and the internal consistency coefficient. And then we want to talk about convergent evidence. Your text calls it convergent evidence. Traditionally, we would have called this convergent validity. And then your text also uses discriminant evidence. And traditionally, we would have used discriminant validity. So I want you to understand what these terms are and what the definitions of those terms are, whether you're using sort of the updated terminology or the traditional terminology. And that is the end of chapter 8.